On Christmas Eve, I thought a burnt turkey was my biggest problem until my own brother handcuffed me. Amid the flashing lights, I saw the homeless man I fed every Monday watching. Weeks later, right before my sentencing, that man stood up in court and ripped off a fake beard. My brother froze. They thought I was a sacrificial lamb, but they forgot that survivors learn fast how to drag their enemies down with them. My name is Evelyn Locke. I am 28 years old. And until tonight, the most rebellious thing I had ever done was sneak an extra packet of sugar into my morning latte. I work as a logistics coordinator at Redwood Harbor Logistics in Ravensbridge, Oregon. It is a job that fits me like a sensible pair of shoes. I like spreadsheets. I like knowing exactly where a shipping container is at any given second. I like safety. In my world, X always leads to Y. And if you follow the rules, nothing bad is supposed to happen to you. I have never been arrested. I have never even received a speeding ticket. I am the girl who stays late to double-check the manifests because I am terrified of making a mistake. I am the girl who loves Christmas because it is the one time of year when the world feels scripted in a way that makes sense. Or at least, that is what I told myself as I basted the turkey in my parents' kitchen. The house smelled of roasted garlic, sage, and the heavy, sweet scent of cinnamon sticks boiling on the stove. It was the smell of my childhood, or rather, the smell of the childhood I always tried to curate for my family. My mother, Teresa, was fluttering around the dining room, straightening the napkins for the third time. She was 50 years old, but the night shifts at the hospital had carved deep, gray hollows beneath her eyes that even her festive makeup could not quite hide. She was the peacemaker, the buffer zone between the rest of us and the man sitting in the recliner in the living room. Martin Locke, my father, was 52 years old, though he carried himself like a man of 70 who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He owned a garage and custom body shop on the edge of town. Grease and motor oil seemed permanently etched into his knuckles, just as a permanent scowl seemed etched into his forehead. He was watching the football game, ignoring the bustle of the holiday. I wiped my hands on my apron and checked the oven timer. 10 minutes. I needed everything to be perfect. If the skin on the turkey was not crispy enough, Dad would make a comment. If the stuffing was too dry, he would push it to the side of his plate without a word, a silent indictment of my failure. I was 28, yet in this house, I felt like I was 8 years old again, desperate for a pat on the head that never came. My cousin Sarah poked her head into the kitchen, holding a glass of wine. She asked me if I was seeing anyone yet. I told her no. I was focusing on work. She gave me that pitying smile, the one that says it must be sad to be so alone. I turned back to the potatoes, mashing them with more force than necessary. They did not understand. My life was small, yes, but it was mine. It had its own quiet rhythms that brought me peace. Every Monday morning, before I clocked in at the logistics center, I stopped at the bakery on 4th Street. I bought a large black coffee and took the leftover weekend sandwiches they sold at a discount. I walked 2 blocks to the old industrial park, near the rusting chain-link fence where the weeds grew waist-high. That was where old Ben sat. He was a fixture of the neighborhood, a man with a beard so thick and silver it looked like steel wool. He always wore the same tattered army surplus coat, regardless of the weather. Most people in Ravensbridge walked past him as if he were part of the crumbling masonry, but for some reason, I stopped. I gave him the coffee. I gave him the sandwiches. He never said much, just nodded and accepted the food with hands that shook slightly. Sometimes, if it was raining, I would stand there under my umbrella for a few minutes and talk about the weather or the traffic. It was the only time in my week when I felt like I was doing something purely for the sake of goodness, with no expectation of a performance review or a family critique. Old Ben was the only man in my life who looked at me without judging what I had achieved or failed to achieve. But here, in this house, judgment was the main course. We finally sat down to dinner around 6 o'clock. The table was crowded with aunts, uncles, and cousins. The crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, catching the reflection of the Christmas tree lights blinking in the corner. Bing Crosby was crooning from the record player, a scratchy, comforting sound that masked the tension radiating from the head of the table. Martin carved the turkey. He sliced the meat with surgical precision, his movements sharp and aggressive. He looked around the table and asked where Cole was. Cole Locke, my brother. He was 31, 3 years older than me, and the golden sun around which our family orbit revolved. Cole was a police officer with the Ravensbridge Police Department. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of jawline that made people trust him instinctively. Mom said Cole was running late because he had a shift, but he promised to stop by for dinner. Dad grunted and slapped a piece of white meat onto his plate. He said it was a shame Cole had to work while the rest of us sat around, but that was the price of being important. He looked directly at me when he said it. He said he wished I had half the spine my brother had. He asked me if I was still pushing papers at that warehouse. I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned white. I told him I was a senior dispatcher now, that I managed the routes for 40 trucks. Dad laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He said 40 trucks or 400. It was still just moving boxes for other people. He said Cole was out there cleaning up the streets, making Ravensbridge safe, actually doing something with his life. The table went quiet. Aunt Linda tried to break the silence by complimenting the cranberry sauce. Mom reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Her skin was dry and paper-thin. She whispered that the turkey was delicious. I forced a smile and swallowed a bite of food that tasted like ash. This was the routine. I was the disappointment, the safe bet, the one who stayed in the background. Cole was the hero. Then we heard it. It started as a low wail in the distance, bouncing off the snow-covered hills. Sirens, not just one, but a chorus of them. They were getting louder, drawing closer with every second. Uncle Jerry chuckled, a piece of cornbread crumbling on his lip. He joked that Cole must be bringing the whole SWAT team for leftovers. He said Cole probably wanted to make an entrance. The mood at the table lightened. Everyone loved the idea of Cole arriving in a blaze of glory. It fit the narrative. The hero returning from the war on crime to eat Christmas dinner. Mom smiled, her face relaxing for the first time all day. She squeezed my hand again and said she had a good feeling about this year. She said she felt like things were finally going to turn a corner for our family. I should have known better. In horror movies, the character who says everything is going to be fine is always the first one to scream. The dining room window suddenly exploded with light. It was not the warm glow of Christmas bulbs. It was a violent, strobe-like flashing of red and blue. The light swept across the walls, washing out the faces of my relatives, turning the roast turkey into a grotesque, pulsating gray. Brakes screeched outside. Car doors slammed. 1, 2, 3, 4 slams. The chatter stopped. My cousin Sarah stood up and ran to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. She gasped. She said there were 5 police cars on the lawn. My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought something terrible had happened to Cole. I thought he had been shot. I thought this was the notification squad coming to tell Martin Locke that his golden boy was gone. I stood up, my legs trembling, and followed the family to the window. Neighbors were already coming out onto their porches, wrapping their robes tight against the cold, holding up their phones to record whatever was happening at the Locke residence. Then, the front door opened. We had not unlocked it. They just walked in. But it was not a chaplain coming to deliver bad news. It was Cole. He walked into the hallway, still wearing his heavy patrol jacket, his badge gleaming under the foyer light, but he was not smiling. He was not holding a bottle of wine or a bag of gifts. His face was a mask of stone. Behind him stood a detective in a cheap suit and 2 other uniformed officers I did not recognize. Dad stood up, his napkin falling to the floor. He started to ask what was going on, a smile half forming on his lips, ready to greet his son. Cole did not look at Dad. He did not look at Mom. His eyes locked onto me. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the scratching of Bing Crosby singing about peace on earth. Cole walked straight into the dining room. He stopped 3 feet away from me. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his hairline. Despite the freezing temperature outside, his eyes were cold, void of any brotherly warmth I had ever searched for. He spoke, and his voice was flat, professional, terrifying. He announced that they had received an anonymous tip regarding the trafficking of narcotics. He said they had probable cause to believe that I, Evelyn Locke, was using my vehicle and my access at Redwood Harbor Logistics to transport significant quantities of cocaine. I stared at him. My brain could not process the words. It sounded like he was speaking a foreign language. I tried to laugh, thinking this was a prank, a cruel joke to liven up the party. I asked him what he was talking about. I called him by his name. I reached out to touch his arm. He slapped my hand away. He pulled a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the ratchet clicking open was the loudest thing I had ever heard. He told me to turn around and place my hands behind my back. Mom screamed. It was a high, thin sound that shattered the atmosphere. She grabbed Cole's arm, begging him to stop, telling him this was his sister. Cole did not flinch. He looked over Mom's head at the other officers and nodded. He told the room that this was now an active crime scene. He ordered everyone to step away from the table and keep their hands visible. The detective stepped forward and informed us that they had a warrant to search my car, which was parked in the driveway, and my personal belongings. I looked at my father. I expected him to roar. I expected him to throw the table over and demand to know who dared to accuse his daughter. I expected him to defend me. Martin Locke stood by his chair, his face pale, his mouth a thin line. He looked at Cole, then he looked at me, and in his eyes, I did not see outrage. I saw calculation. He took a half step back, away from me, as if my proximity might stain him. Cole grabbed my wrist. His grip was bruising. He spun me around. The cold steel bit into my skin. 1 click, 2 clicks. My face was pressed against the wall where our family photos hung. I was staring directly at a picture of Cole and me when we were children, building a snowman. I gasped that I was innocent. I told him there was a mistake. Cole leaned in close to my ear, his breath hot against my neck. He whispered for me to shut up and stop making a scene. He marched me out of the dining room, past the Christmas tree, past the presents I had wrapped with such care the night before. The front door was wide open, letting in the biting wind and the swirling snow. As he shoved me out onto the porch, the cold air hit me like a physical blow. The front lawn was a sea of flashing lights. The neighbors were watching. The cameras were rolling. And there, across the street, standing just outside the perimeter of the yellow tape they were already stringing up, I saw a figure. It was old Ben. He was not shivering. He was not looking down at his feet as he usually did. He was standing tall, staring straight at me. The flashing red lights reflected in his eyes, and for a split second, he did not look like the confused, harmless old man I fed every Monday. He looked like a witness. Cole pushed me toward the squad car. He put his hand on top of my head to guide me into the back seat, just like they do on television. The door slammed shut, sealing me inside the cage. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant filled my nose. Through the wire mesh, I watched the detective pop the trunk of my sedan. I saw him lift the liner. I saw him pull out a black bag I had never seen before in my life. He held it up for Cole to see. Cole nodded. My brother turned back toward the house, toward the warmth, toward the family that was no longer mine. He left me alone in the dark, handcuffed, freezing, while the radio in the front seat crackled with the static of a life that had just ended. The walk from the dining room to the front door was only 20 feet, but it felt like I was wading through wet cement. The air in the hallway was suffocating, thick with the silent judgment of the people who were supposed to love me. Cole gripped my elbow with a pressure that was professional, almost clinical. He did not drag me. He guided me with a terrifying politeness, the kind of courtesy you extend to a stranger you are removing from a building. He leaned in close, his voice low and steady, telling me to just cooperate so we could get this over with quickly. It was a lie. I could see it in the set of his jaw. He was not my brother in that moment. He was Officer Locke, and I was just another case file number he was eager to process. I stumbled as we reached the foyer, my knees buckling under the weight of the reality crashing down on me. I instinctively reached out for my mother. She was hovering near the coat rack, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish towel. I wanted her to scream, to throw herself between me and the men with the guns, to demand they release her daughter. Instead, she looked at Cole, then back at me, her eyes swimming with fear and confusion. She whispered that I should just go with him. She said Cole would take care of me. She said it as if he were taking me to a dentist appointment, not hauling me off to a cage. Then came the first planted evidence, executed with the sleight of hand of a magician. A young officer, one I did not recognize, was patting down the coats hanging on the rack. He reached into the pocket of my beige trench coat, the one I had worn to work every single day for 3 years. He pulled his hand out, and in his palm sat 3 small, clear plastic bags filled with white powder. A gasp rippled through the hallway. My Aunt Linda covered her mouth. My cousins took a synchronized step backward, as if I were radioactive. They were not looking at me with concern anymore. They were looking at me with revulsion. The gap between us widened, not just physically, but emotionally. I was being severed from the family tree right before their eyes. I tried to speak, to scream that I had never seen those bags before, but the words caught in my throat like dry sand. I looked at my father. Martin Locke was standing in the doorway of the living room. He was not looking at the drugs. He was looking at me. His arms were crossed over his chest, a barrier of flesh and bone that I could not penetrate. I begged him to say something. I pleaded with my eyes. He did not unfold his arms. He stared at me with eyes as cold as the winter night outside and said that if I did it, the law should handle it. He said this house did not shelter criminals. The sentence hit me harder than the cold wind that blasted me as Cole shoved me out onto the porch. My father had not just failed to defend me, he had convicted me before a judge had even been appointed. Outside, the nightmare expanded. The flashing lights painted the snow in violent shades of crimson and cobalt. The neighbors were lined up along the sidewalk, phones raised, capturing the fall of the Locke family's disappointment. I was led toward the patrol car, but they stopped me so I could watch the spectacle of the search. The detective was dismantling my sedan. I watched, shivering uncontrollably in my thin sweater, as he ripped the fabric lining from the trunk. He reached into a hollow space behind the wheel well, a compartment I did not even know existed in the car I had driven for 5 years. He pulled out a brick-sized package wrapped in heavy duct tape, then another, then a third. It was a magic trick. It had to be. There was no way that amount of contraband had been sitting inches from my spare tire while I drove to get groceries, while I drove to church, while I drove to the park to feed old Ben. I looked across the street, desperate for a familiar anchor in this storm. I found old Ben standing near the streetlight, but he was not looking at me with the steady, vacant gaze I was used to. He was clutching the cold metal of the lamppost so hard his knuckles were white. His eyes were wide, filled with a raw, visceral panic. For a second, our gazes locked, and I saw something like horror in his expression. Then, he turned abruptly, pulling his collar up, and disappeared into the shadows of the alleyway. Even the homeless man, the one person I thought I had a pure connection with, could not bear to witness my shame. The ride to the precinct was silent. Cole drove. I sat in the back, the hard plastic seat digging into my spine. I watched the back of his head, looking for a sign of the brother who used to teach me how to ride a bike. There was nothing, just the stiff posture of a man doing a job. At the station, the humiliation became bureaucratic. Fingerprints, mugshot, the surrender of my shoelaces and jewelry. Then, the interrogation room. It was a small, windowless box that smelled of stale sweat and aggressive cleaning chemicals. Cole did not leave. He sat across from me, next to Detective Keller, a man with a face like crumpled paper and eyes that had seen too many lies to recognize the truth. Cole placed a file on the metal table. He did not look me in the eye. He read from a report, his voice devoid of emotion. He stated that they had received a credible anonymous tip 2 days ago. He said the informant described a logistics coordinator at Redwood Harbor who was using commercial shipping routes to move product for a local cartel. He said the tipster identified me by name. I slammed my hand on the table, the handcuffs rattling. I shouted that I was just a dispatcher. I told them I managed schedules and radio frequencies. I told them I had never touched a drug in my life. I looked at Cole, begging him to stop reading, to stop pretending this was real. Detective Keller leaned forward, his chair scraping against the linoleum. He smirked, a dry, humorless twisting of his lips. He told me that everyone says they are innocent the first time they get caught. He said I fit the profile perfectly. The quiet, invisible employee that nobody suspects. He said those are always the dangerous ones. They kept me there for 3 hours. They asked about names I did not know. They asked about routes I had never assigned. Every time I denied it, Cole would just make a note in his notebook, the scratching of his pen sounding like a knife sharpening against a stone. Eventually, they gave up for the night. A uniformed officer led me to a holding cell. The door clanged shut with a finality that made my blood run cold. The cell was freezing. The air smelled of urine, bleach, and old misery. There was a woman in the cell down the hall screaming about demons, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. I sat on the thin mattress, pulling my knees to my chest. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing, suffocating darkness. I replayed the dinner in my head, the burnt turkey, the music, the look on my father's face, the seamless way Cole had transitioned from brother to captor. I began to doubt my own sanity. Had I missed signs? Was I really that stupid? I had spent my life trying to be good, trying to be safe, trying to follow the rules so that nothing bad would happen, and yet, here I was. I thought about the packets in my coat pocket. Someone had to have put them there, someone who had access to my house, or my work. The realization crept in like a poisonous fog. I had been set up, and the only people close enough to do it were the ones who had just watched me be dragged away. I did not sleep. I watched the shadows lengthen and shorten as the artificial lights buzzed overhead. Morning brought no relief, only a fresh wave of pain. I was allowed a brief visitation in the secure room, separated from the world by a thick pane of scratched glass. My mother was there. She looked as if she had aged 10 years overnight. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed from crying. She pressed her hand against the glass, her palm flattening against the barrier. She told me she was going to find a lawyer. She said she would fix this. She was frantic, her voice trembling through the intercom. Then I saw my father standing behind her. He did not step up to the glass. He did not sit down. He stood near the door, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his grease-stained jacket. He looked at me with a detachment that broke whatever was left of my heart. He spoke loud enough for the microphone to pick up, but he did not come closer. He said that he had built his business on a reputation of honesty. He said he had worked too hard for 30 years to have his name dragged through the mud by a junkie daughter. I tried to interrupt, to tell him I was not a junkie, but he cut me off. He said that if I was involved in this mess, I should not expect him to bail me out. He said I made my bed, and now I had to sleep in it. He turned around and walked out of the room without looking back. My mother sobbed, her hands sliding down the glass, but she did not run after him. She stayed, trapped between her husband and her daughter, paralyzed by her own weakness. I sat there, the plastic receiver in my hand, listening to the dial tone of my life. The message was clear. I was not just arrested, I was erased. My brother had put me in cuffs, and my father had just locked the door and thrown away the key. I was 28 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, terrifiedly alone. The courtroom smelled of lemon floor polish and stale anxiety. It was a sterile, suffocating scent that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands clasped so tightly together that my fingers had turned the color of old parchment. The handcuffs had been removed for the proceeding, but the phantom weight of the cold steel remained on my wrists. To my right sat Darren Coley, the public defender the state had assigned to me. He looked barely older than a college student, with a suit that was half a size too big and a nervous habit of clicking his ballpoint pen against his legal pad. He had met me for exactly 10 minutes before the hearing, during which he had mostly stared at the floor and mumbled about caseloads. On the paper in front of him, the words, "Possession with intent to distribute," were written in bold, jagged letters. Beside that charge was the potential sentence: 25 years. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. 25 years. I would be 53 years old when I got out. My life was effectively over before the gavel had even banged for order. Across the aisle, the prosecution looked like a machine built for destruction. Marcia Holt was a woman who seemed to be carved out of granite. She wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my car, and her movements were sharp, precise, and predatory. She did not look at me. To her, I was not a person, I was a statistic, a win to be filed away before lunch. The preliminary hearing began with a blur of legal jargon that sounded like a foreign language. Then, Marcia Holt stood up. The room went silent. She projected her voice with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the game. She began to lay out the evidence, piece by piece, building a cage around me with facts that were simultaneously true and completely false. She presented the photographs taken at the scene. There was my Toyota sedan, trunk open, the lining ripped away to reveal the brick-sized packages of cocaine. There was my beige trench coat, the pockets turned inside out to show the smaller baggies the officer had pulled out in my parents' hallway. She held up the arrest report, signed by Officer Cole Locke. She spoke about the anonymous source. She claimed that this confidential informant had provided specific details about a logistics coordinator at Redwood Harbor Logistics who was using commercial trucking routes to traffic narcotics across state lines. She painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, with me at the center, the quiet, unassuming dispatcher who manipulated the schedules to move poison through the city. Darren stood up to cross-examine, but his voice cracked on the first syllable. He tried to raise questions about the validity of the anonymous call. He suggested that it was too convenient, that the placement of the drugs in the coat felt staged. He used the word entrapment, but he said it with a question mark at the end, robbing it of any power. Judge Harrison, a man with a face like a wrinkled bulldog, peered over his spectacles. He asked Darren if he had any physical evidence to support the claim of a setup. Darren shuffled his papers, looked at me with panicked eyes, and admitted that at this time, we did not. The judge grunted and leaned back. The scale had already tipped. I felt the eyes of the room on me. It was a physical sensation, like ants crawling on my skin. The gallery was packed. Half of them were reporters, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. I could hear their whispers rising like steam. They were saying that I was the sister of the hero cop. They were saying it was a tragedy for the Locke family. They were looking at me not with sympathy, but with the morbid curiosity one reserves for a two-headed calf at a carnival. I turned my head slightly, unable to stop myself from looking for my family. My mother was not there. I found out later she had collapsed from a panic attack and was sedated at home. But my father was there. Martin Locke sat in the second row, directly behind the prosecutor's bench. He was not looking at me. He was staring straight ahead at the judge, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in that familiar, unyielding line. During a brief recess while the stenographer changed her paper roll, I saw something that made the blood freeze in my veins. Marcia Holt leaned over the railing and whispered something to my father. Martin nodded. It was a short, sharp nod of agreement. He did not look like a grieving father hoping for mercy for his child. He looked like a partner in a business transaction. Why was my father speaking to the woman trying to put me in prison for 25 years? Why were they so comfortable with each other? The question hammered in my brain, but I had no time to process it because the bailiff called the next witness, Officer Cole Locke. My brother walked to the stand with the stride of a man who owned the building. He was in his full-dress uniform, every button gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Marcia Holt asked him to describe my behavior in the months leading up to the arrest. Cole looked at the jury box, though there was no jury yet, only the judge, and sighed, a performance of pained reluctance. He said that I had been distant. He said I had been staying late at the office 3 or 4 nights a week, often refusing to say what I was working on. He said I had stopped coming to Sunday dinners regularly. He described a woman who was secretive, isolated, and living a double life. He did not mention that I stayed late because I was covering shifts for a coworker with a sick child. He did not mention that I stopped coming to dinners because I was tired of being the punchline to his jokes. He took the mundane details of my lonely life and twisted them until they looked like the habits of a drug runner. He never looked at me, not once. It was as if I were already a ghost. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout that he was lying by omission, that he was twisting the knife he had already stuck in my back. But Darren placed a hand on my forearm, pressing down. He told me to stay calm. He said an outburst would only hurt me. I slumped back in my chair, feeling the fight drain out of me. I looked away from my brother, unable to stomach the sight of his polished badge. My gaze drifted to the back of the courtroom, seeking a dark corner where I could hide my eyes. That was when I saw him. In the very last row, tucked into the shadow of a pillar, sat a man. At first glance, he looked like any other curious citizen who had wandered in out of the cold. But I knew the shape of those shoulders. I knew the set of that jaw. It was old Ben. But it was not the Ben I knew. The shopping cart was gone. The plastic bags tied to his belt loops were gone. He was wearing a wool coat. It was old and frayed at the cuffs, but it was clean. It was buttoned properly. His hair, usually a wild tangle of gray static, was smoothed back. He was not sleeping. He was not muttering to himself. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on the witness stand. He was watching Cole with an intensity that was terrifyingly sharp. I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. I must have made a noise, or perhaps he just felt the weight of my gaze, because his eyes shifted. He looked directly at me. For a second, the courtroom faded away. It was just me and the man I had fed sandwiches to for 3 years. I started to sit up straighter, an instinctive urge to acknowledge him, to signal for help, to do something. Ben's eyes narrowed. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Left, right, a tiny movement. Don't! Then, he did something even stranger. As Cole finished his testimony and began to step down from the witness stand, Ben sank lower in his seat. He pulled the collar of his coat up, shielding his face, deliberately hiding his profile from my brother's line of sight. He was afraid of Cole, or he was hiding from him. A spark of something hot and sharp ignited in my chest. Why would a homeless man clean himself up to come to my preliminary hearing? Why would he warn me to be silent? And why was he terrified of my brother seeing him? The gavel banged, shattering the moment. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. He stated that based on the evidence presented, the significant quantity of narcotics, the corroborating testimony of the arresting officer, and the credible nature of the tip, the court found sufficient cause to bind the case over for trial. Darren asked for bail. He suggested $50,000. The prosecutor laughed. It was a short, sharp bark. She requested remand, citing the flight risk and the severity of the charges. The judge set bail at $500,000. He might as well have said $5 billion. It was a number so large it was meaningless to me. The hearing was over. The bailiff moved behind me, his hand reaching for my arm to guide me back to the holding cell. The reporters were already sprinting for the doors, their phones pressed to their ears, dictating the headline that would ruin what was left of my life. Hero officer arrests sister in Christmas drug bust. I stood up, my legs feeling like wood. I looked back at the last row, but the seat was empty. Old Ben was gone. As they led me through the side door, back into the sterile, echoing hallway of the courthouse, the despair washed over me again, but this time, mixed in with the fear and the humiliation, there was a tiny, jagged shard of a question. Who was that man? And what did he know that I did not? I was walking back to a cage, but for the first time since the handcuffs clicked shut on Christmas Eve, I wasn't just thinking about survival, I was thinking about the truth, and the truth, I was beginning to realize, was hiding in the shadows of the life I thought I knew. The morning of the sentencing, the air in the holding cell felt heavier than usual, as if the gravity in the room had been dialed up to crush me against the concrete floor. Darren Coley, my public defender, sat across from me on the metal bench. He was not clicking his pen today. He was sitting on his hands, a gesture of defeat that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then finally at me. He told me that he had gone over the case files a dozen times. He said he had looked for a loophole, a clerical error, anything to pry the jaws of the state open. But there was nothing. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of a decorated police officer was unassailable. The anonymous recording, which the judge had ruled admissible despite Darren's weak objections, was the final nail. He told me, his voice barely a whisper, that the likelihood of acquittal was 0. He used the word 0 like it was a physical blow. He said I needed to prepare myself for the maximum sentence, 25 years. I felt the blood drain from my face. 25 years. I would rot in a cage until I was an old woman. I would never have a family. I would never see the ocean again. I would never just sit on a porch and drink coffee. My life was being measured out in decades of darkness, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. The walk to the courtroom felt like a funeral procession. My own. When I entered, the noise was deafening. The gallery was packed to capacity. It seemed the whole town of Ravensbridge had turned out to watch the final act of the Locke family tragedy. The cameras flashed, a blinding strobe light that disoriented me. I took my seat. My hands were shaking so badly I had to tuck them under my thighs to keep them from vibrating against the table. Marcia Holt stood up. She did not walk. She prowled. She moved back and forth in front of the jury box, weaving a story that was so detailed, so logical, that even I started to wonder if I had done it in my sleep. She described a woman who was a master of deception. She pointed at me. She said, "Look at her. Look how quiet she is. Look how plain she is. That is the point." She told the jury that predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the girl next door. She said I had used my position at Redwood Harbor to orchestrate a sophisticated supply chain for poison. She said I had hidden behind a facade of mediocrity while I poisoned the community. Then came the line that sucked the air out of the room. She turned to the gallery, gesturing toward where my brother sat in the front row. She said that my corruption ran so deep, my deception was so complete, that my own brother, a man sworn to protect this city, had been forced to place the handcuffs on his baby sister to save the community she was destroying. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound of pure scandal, delicious and horrified. I stood up. I did not mean to. It was a reflex, a spasm of survival instinct. Darren grabbed my jacket, trying to pull me down, but I shrugged him off. My voice sounded thin and reedy in the cavernous room. I told them it was not true. I told them I spent my extra money buying sandwiches for the homeless. I told them I worked overtime because I needed the money to fix my car, not to traffic drugs. I told them I had never even had a parking ticket. Marcia Holt did not even blink. She smiled, a cold, predatory curving of her lips. She asked the jury if that did not sound exactly like the cover story of someone trying to hide a double life. She called it a painting I had made to cover the rot in the wall. Someone in the back row laughed. It was a short, sharp sound of derision. Then another. They were laughing at me. My defense was a joke to them. I sank back into my chair. It was over. I was buried. The judge, a man with a face like a stone gargoyle, shuffled his papers. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at me, and I saw no mercy in his eyes, only boredom. He reached for his gavel. Time began to warp. The seconds stretched out, becoming long, agonizing minutes. I could hear everything. I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper 3 rows back. I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. I could hear the erratic thumping of my own heart, banging against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, 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 thump. I looked down at the front row. My father, Martin, leaned in close to Cole. He whispered something. Cole looked at him, and then, for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw their masks slip. Cole's mouth twitched at the corner. It was a smirk, a tiny, fleeting expression of relief and triumph. Martin patted Cole's knee. It was a gesture of congratulations. They were not mourning the loss of a daughter and sister. They were celebrating a successful transaction. They had cut out the cancer, me, to save the body of their criminal enterprise. A coldness, deeper than the winter outside, spread from the base of my skull down my spine. I was not just a victim of circumstance, I was a sacrifice. My gaze drifted, almost against my will, to the back of the room, to the very last row. Old Ben was there. He was sitting rigid, his body tense as a coiled spring. His hands, rough and scarred, were gripping his faded wool hat so tight that his knuckles were white. He was staring at the floor, his lips moving silently. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, debating whether to jump. The judge cleared his throat. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He raised the gavel. The wood gleamed under the lights. The gavel reached its apex. It started to descend. "Stop!" The scream ripped through the courtroom, raw and jagged. It was not a shout of protest. It was a howl of pain. My eyes snapped open. The gavel hovered inches from the block. The entire room turned as one. Old Ben was standing. He was trembling violently. His face flushed a deep, alarming red. He was no longer the invisible man on the park bench. He was burning with a terrifying energy. His eyes were wide, wild, and fixed directly on the judge. He shouted that if the judge sentenced me, he would be sealing a lie. He pointed a shaking finger at the bench. He said it was a dirty play, a script. For a second, there was total silence, the kind of silence that follows an explosion. Then, chaos. Cole shot up from his seat in the front row. He did not look confused. He did not look like a concerned officer keeping the peace. He looked panicked. His face had drained of color. He shouted at the bailiffs. He ordered them to remove the man. He screamed that the man was disturbed, that he was a threat to the court. His voice was too high, too desperate. I looked at my brother. He was not looking at me. He was staring at Ben with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Why? Why was the hero cop afraid of the town beggar? 2 security guards started to move toward Ben, their hands on their belts. Ben did not back down. He stepped into the aisle. He ripped the wool hat off his head and threw it on the floor. He stood tall, his posture changing, the stoop of the homeless man vanishing to reveal a spine of steel. The judge slammed his gavel down, but not to sentence me. He banged it for order. He bellowed that there would be order in his court. He demanded to know what was the meaning of this outburst. Cole was shouting over him, telling the guards to drag Ben out, to arrest him for contempt. "I have proof." Ben's voice cut through the noise, deeper now, authoritative. "I have evidence that shows the person who should be sitting in that defendant's chair is not that girl." He reached into his coat pocket. The security guards flinched, hands going to their holsters. "Don't shoot!" I screamed. I didn't know why, but I knew I couldn't let them hurt him. Ben did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small black flash drive and a thick manila envelope. He held them up like a shield. "I am not a disturbance," Ben announced, his voice steadying, the tremor gone. "And I am not leaving until this court sees what is on this drive." The judge looked at Cole, who was now standing in the aisle, his face slick with sweat, looking like he wanted to vault over the railing and tackle the old man himself. Then the judge looked at Ben, standing alone against the weight of the room. The judge lowered the gavel slowly. He held up a hand to the security guards, signaling them to hold their positions. He looked at Ben and asked who he was. Ben looked at me. His eyes were sad, apologetic, and fiercely protective. Then he looked back at the judge. He said he was a witness to a crime that started long before Christmas Eve, and he said he was ready to testify. The air in the room didn't just still, it froze. The silence that followed was heavy with the promise of violence, of secrets about to be ripped into the light. And in that silence, I saw my father slowly sink back into his seat, his face the color of ash. The courtroom was suspended in a vacuum of stunned silence. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room, leaving us gasping, waiting for the laws of physics to reassert themselves. The security guards hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts, unsure whether to tackle the man or listen to him. The man I knew as Old Ben stood in the center aisle, the focal point of 500 staring eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he began to dismantle the person I thought I knew. He reached up and peeled away the thick, matted beard. It did not come off in clumps. It came off in a single, prosthetic sheet, revealing a jawline that was sharp, clean-shaven, and utterly unfamiliar. He pulled a wig from his head, letting a head of short, salt and pepper hair spring free. He unbuttoned the oversized, filthy coat and let it drop to the floor, stepping out of it like a butterfly shedding a dead chrysalis. The stoop in his back vanished. The tremor in his hands evaporated. Standing there was not a homeless man. Standing there was a man in his 40s, wearing a fitted tactical shirt and dark cargo pants. He looked dangerous. He looked precise. And his eyes, those eyes that used to look at me with gratitude when I handed him a bagel, were now sweeping the room with the cold calculation of a predator assessing a threat. "My name," he announced, his voice booming off the mahogany walls without a hint of a rasp, "is Jonah Mercer, former detective, Internal Affairs, Ravensbridge Police Department." A ripple of shock went through the room. I heard a reporter in the front row gasp, "He's dead. Mercer died 3 years ago." I stared at him, my mouth agape. Jonah Mercer. I remembered the name. It was a headline from 3 years ago. A car accident on the cliffs, a body never found, a funeral with an empty casket. The story was that he had been driving drunk, a tragic end to a promising career. "For the past 3 years," Jonah continued, turning to face the judge, "I have been living on the streets of this city. I have been watching. I have been listening. Because when I tried to report the rot inside the department through official channels, my brakes were cut and my car went off a cliff. So, I decided that if I could not fight them as a detective, I would fight them as a ghost." He pointed a finger directly at the prosecution's table. "I have been documenting a narcotics and money laundering ring that operates out of Martin Locke's garage and utilizes the compromised officers of the Ravensbridge PD for protection, a ring that includes Officer Cole Locke." The judge looked like he had been slapped. The prosecutor, Marcia Holt, had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But I was not looking at the lawyers. I was looking at Jonah. My mind was reeling, rewinding 3 years of memories, every Monday morning, every cup of coffee, every time I sat on that bench and complained about my life. I realized with a jolt that made me dizzy, I had been his informant. I had told him about the late-night shipments I wasn't allowed to log. I had told him about Dad's sudden influx of cash for renovations. I had told him about Cole's new, expensive watch that a cop's salary couldn't buy. I thought I was just venting to a lonely old man. I thought I was being kind, but all that time, he was mining me for information. I had unknowingly handed him the map to my family's destruction. "This is preposterous," Cole shouted, though his voice cracked. "He's a lunatic. He's an imposter." Jonah ignored him. He walked forward, straight to the court clerk, and placed the black flash drive and the hard drive on the desk. "Your Honor," Jonah said, his tone eerily calm, "what I have on this drive is not hearsay. It is surveillance footage taken on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, from a camera I installed in the tree directly facing the locked driveway 2 weeks prior." The judge hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the panicked faces of the police officers in the room, and then he made a decision that changed everything. "Play it," the judge ordered. The clerk plugged the drive into the court's projection system. A large screen descended from the ceiling. The room went dark, save for the blue glow of the monitor. The video was grainy, shot in night vision, but the image was unmistakable. It showed my parents' driveway. Snow was falling. My silver Toyota was parked near the garage. A figure walked into the frame. It was Cole. He was not in uniform yet. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie. He looked around nervously, checking the windows of the house. Then, he produced a slim tool from his pocket, a jimmy tool used to unlock car doors. He popped the trunk of my car in seconds. The entire courtroom watched in horrified fascination as my brother, the hero, the golden boy, pulled 3 large, brick-sized packages from inside his jacket. He peeled back the trunk liner with practiced ease and stuffed the drugs into the wheel well. He reassembled the liner, smoothing it down so it looked untouched. He closed the trunk. But the video did not end there. It showed him walking to the front porch. It showed him opening the front door with his key. The camera angle switched. Jonah had more than one. This one was looking through the living room window. It showed Cole walking to the coat rack. It showed him finding my beige trench coat. It showed him pulling small plastic baggies from his pocket and slipping them into my coat. Then, he checked his watch, took a deep breath, and walked into the kitchen to join the family for dinner, to eat the turkey I had cooked, to hug me. The screen went black. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, the room exploded. Reporters were shouting. Flashbulbs were popping like gunfire. People in the gallery were standing on the benches to get a better look. I looked at my father. Martin Locke was not moving. He was staring at the blank screen, his face a mask of gray clay. The blood had drained from him so completely that he looked like a corpse propped up in a suit. He knew. He had known the whole time. Cole was shaking his head violently. He looked like a trapped animal. "No, that's fake. That's AI. It's a deepfake. He edited it." Jonah did not even raise his voice. He handed a thick stack of papers to the bailiff to pass to the judge. Attached is a digital forensic authentication report from an independent cybersecurity firm in Seattle, as well as a corroborating affidavit from the FBI field office I contacted 6 months ago. The metadata is intact, the video is real, and Officer Locke is done. The judge scanned the documents, his eyebrows climbing higher with every page. He looked over his glasses at Cole, and the look was one of pure disgust. I sat there, frozen. The handcuffs of shame that had bound me for weeks were shattering, but what replaced them was a hollow, aching grief. My brother had not just arrested me, he had framed me. He had premeditated it. He had planted the evidence, then sat down and ate dinner with me, waiting for the moment to destroy my life. Jonah turned away from the bench and walked toward the defense table. He stopped in front of me. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the softness of old Ben in the eyes of this hardened detective. "I am sorry, Evelyn," he said quietly, ignoring the chaos erupting around us. "I am sorry I had to use you. I am sorry I had to wait until the trap was sprung to step in." "Why me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why did you pick me to watch? Was I just a tool?" Jonah shook his head. "No, you weren't a tool. You were a promise." He reached into his pocket, not the evidence pocket, but the pocket near his heart, and pulled out a worn, laminated photograph. He held it up for me to see. It was a picture of a woman standing next to a young police recruit. The recruit was Jonah, 20 years younger. The woman was elderly, with kind eyes and a stern set to her jaw. I gasped. "Grandma Agnes." "Agnes Hart was the one who sponsored me when I was a rookie," Jonah said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the only one who believed in me when I was a kid from the wrong side of the tracks. She knew what your father was. She suspected what Cole was becoming. Before she passed away, she called me to her bedside." Tears pricked my eyes. My grandmother had died 4 years ago. I thought she had left me alone in this house of wolves. She told me that her granddaughter had a heart too soft for the family she was born into. Jonah continued. "She made me promise that if the day ever came when they tried to consume you, when they tried to throw you to the wolves to save themselves, I would step out of the shadows. She told me, 'Watch over Evelyn, because when they turn on her, she will have no one.'" He looked at the judge, then back at me. "I have been sitting on that bench for 3 years, freezing and hungry, waiting for this moment. I could have taken Martin down for tax evasion a year ago. I could have busted Cole for bribery. But I waited. Because Agnes knew they would use you as a scapegoat eventually. And she wanted to make sure that when they did, we would be ready to bury them. I looked at the photo of my grandmother. Even from the grave, she had been protecting me. She had placed a guardian angel in a dirty coat on a park bench, knowing that one day, my own father and brother would try to sacrifice me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the weak one. I wasn't the victim they thought I was. I was the one worth saving. "Sheriff," the judge's voice cut through the noise like a thunderclap. "Take Officer Locke into custody immediately and secure Martin Locke. Nobody leaves this room." As the bailiffs moved toward my brother, pulling his own handcuffs from his belt, the same ones he had used on me, Jonah looked at me one last time. "It is over, Evelyn," he said. "The script is flipped." Jonah did not step down from the podium. He stood there like a lecturer in a criminology class, his voice stripping away the layers of my life with the clinical precision of a surgeon. The shock in the courtroom had settled into a heavy, suffocating dread. We were no longer watching a family drama. We were witnessing an autopsy of a crime syndicate. Jonah gestured to the screen, where the video of Cole had been replaced by a complex spiderweb of financial documents. He began to speak, and his tone was terrifyingly devoid of anger. It was just facts, cold, hard, concrete facts. He explained that 3 years ago, while investigating a spike in narcotics distribution in the Riverside district, he had found a recurring anomaly. The drugs were not coming in through the usual street dealers. They were moving in bulk. He traced the distribution pattern back to a fleet of commercial trucks operating out of Redwood Harbor Logistics. I felt a chill crawl up my neck. That was my company. I had spent 5 years coordinating those trucks, ensuring they were on time, ensuring the drivers had their paperwork. I had been the clockwork that made the machine run, never knowing that the machine was grinding up something far darker than auto parts and consumer goods. Jonah continued. He said that the trucks were modifying their manifests at a specific location, Locke's Auto Repair and Custom Body Shop. My father's garage. The screen shifted to show a series of invoices. Jonah pointed out the discrepancies. He highlighted repair orders for engine overhauls that never happened. He pointed to fuel surcharges that were inflated by 400%. He showed transfer logs where tens of thousands of dollars were moved from the logistics company to the garage for consulting fees. It was a money laundering operation. My father was not just fixing cars, he was scrubbing dirty money clean. Then Jonah told the room why he had died. He said that when he had gathered enough evidence to go to his lieutenant, he made the mistake of trusting the chain of command. 2 nights later, while driving along the coastal highway, a black SUV rammed his sedan. They didn't just want to scare him, they pushed him over the guardrail at 60 miles per hour. He survived the crash by a miracle, crawling out of the wreckage before the fuel tank ignited. He hid in the sea caves for 2 days, listening to the police scanner. He heard the officers, his own colleagues, discussing the accident with a casual satisfaction. He realized then that the rot didn't stop at the garage. It went all the way to the top of the division. So, Jonah Mercer died, and the homeless man on the bench was born. I looked at Martin. He was staring at the floor, his jaw working silently. He was not looking at the evidence. He was looking at his own hands, perhaps realizing that the grease on them was never going to wash off. But Jonah was not done. He said that proving the money was the easy part. The hard part was proving the intent. He said he needed the court to understand why I was sitting in the defendant's chair today. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He held it up to the microphone. He said that he had placed listening devices in the garage office 6 months ago. He warned the court that what they were about to hear would be disturbing. He pressed play. Static hissed through the courtroom speakers, followed by the sound of a heavy metal door clanging shut. Then, a voice cut through the noise. It was rough, authoritative, and unmistakably my father's. "The feds are sniffing around the Port Authority. We need to cut the heat." Then another voice, smoother, younger, my brother, Cole. We can't just stop the shipments. Dad, the buyers are already pressing for the holiday load. I didn't say stop, Martin's voice replied. I said we need a distraction. Something loud. Something that makes the department look like they are cracking down. A sacrificial lamb. There was a pause on the tape. The sound of a chair squeaking. Who? Cole asked. We can't use one of the drivers. They know too much. They'll flip. Evelyn, Martin said. The name hung in the air of the courtroom, suspended in the silence like a guillotine blade. I stopped breathing. I felt the blood drain from my head, leaving me dizzy. That was my father's voice. He said my name not with love, not with concern, but with the cold calculation of a butcher selecting a cut of meat. Evelyn? Cole sounded skeptical, but not horrified. She doesn't know anything. She's clean. Exactly. Martin's voice rasped. She's perfect. She's at the logistics hub. She has access to the vehicles. We plant the supply in her car and her coat. You make the arrest. It stays in the family. We control the narrative. She'll go to prison, Dad, Cole said. For a long time. She's weak, Martin replied, and the dismissal in his tone felt like a physical slap. She's always been soft. She won't fight back. She'll sit there and cry and take the plea deal because she thinks it's the right thing to do. She doesn't have the stomach for a war. You, on the other hand, I need you out here. You are the heir to this. You need to stay clean to keep the line running. Evelyn is expendable. Expendable. The word echoed in my ears. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to keep myself upright. All my life, I had tried to please him. I had cooked his meals. I had kept my head down. I had tried to be the good daughter, and to him, I was just an asset to be liquidated when the market got tough. The tape clicked off. Then Jonah played a second clip. It was a phone call. Cole's voice was clear. Yeah, it's done. I've got the Christmas present ready. I'll call in the anonymous tip tomorrow. We'll hit her right at dinner. Maximum exposure. The press will love it. Hero cop arrests sister. It'll buy us 6 months of breathing room while the feds chase their tails. The audio ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Darren, my lawyer. He was looking at me with a mixture of horror and pity, but I could not look at him. I was staring at the table, watching a single teardrop splash onto the polished wood. They had planned it. They had discussed destroying my life while I was probably in the kitchen seasoning their turkey. Jonah turned back to the judge. He was relentless. He put up a new slide. It was a hierarchy chart. At the top was Martin Locke. Below him was Cole. But then, Jonah began to name others. He listed 3 other officers in the precinct. He listed a city council member. He showed the web of corruption that Cole was being groomed to inherit. Cole Locke was not just following orders, Jonah said, his voice hard as iron. He was an active architect of this frame-up. He viewed his sister as an insurance policy, a break glass in case of emergency option. Marcia Holt, the prosecutor, slowly stood up. She looked like she was going to be sick. She turned to the judge, her voice trembling. She said that the state had been unaware of this evidence. She said that if these recordings were authenticated, her office had been used as an instrument of a criminal conspiracy. She looked at Martin and Cole with a hatred that matched my own. She realized she had been their puppet. The judge did not wait for her to finish. His face was red with a suppressed fury. He slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the tension like a gunshot. "This court is in recess," he bellowed. "Bailiffs, take Martin Locke and Officer Cole Locke into custody immediately. I want them held without bail, and I want the district attorney down here within the hour." The room erupted into chaos. The reporters were shouting over each other. The doors banged open as more police rushed in. I watched as the officers, men who had worked with Cole, men who had saluted him, moved in. They pulled Martin from his chair. He did not fight. He looked deflated, a balloon that had lost its air. He looked old. Then they went for Cole. My brother stood up. He tried to pull away, shouting something about a mistake, but they spun him around. They grabbed his wrists. I watched as they pulled the handcuffs from his belt, the same handcuffs that had cut into my skin on Christmas Eve. The metal clicked. Once, twice. Cole looked up. As they began to drag him toward the side door, he locked eyes with me. The arrogance was gone, the cold, professional mask was shattered. In his eyes, I saw a raw, naked panic. He looked like a child who had woken up in the dark. He looked at me as if he expected me to save him, as if he expected the sister he had called weak to rush forward and fix it, just like I used to fix his homework. He mouthed my name, Evie. I sat there, frozen, a part of me, the old part, the part that loved him, wanted to weep. But a newer, harder part of me rose up in my throat. I looked at him, at the man who had called me expendable, the man who had treated my life as a disposable commodity. I did not stand up. I did not look away. I just watched him. He was a stranger. He was a criminal. He was the man who had signed my death warrant. And as the door closed behind him, cutting off his view of me, I realized that the only thing weak about me was my belief that they had ever loved me at all. The wheels of justice usually turn with a grinding, agonizing slowness, but when the FBI verifies that a decorated police officer and a local business owner have been running a narcotics ring, the gears suddenly spin at a terrifying speed. Within 3 hours of Jonah Mercer's revelation, 2 federal agents in dark suits had arrived at the courthouse. They took the hard drive. They took the flash drive. They took Jonah into a private room for a debriefing, and when they came out, the look on their faces told the whole story. Marcia Holt, the prosecutor who had spent the last month painting me as a criminal mastermind, looked as though she had swallowed glass. She stood before the judge, her voice trembling slightly, and filed an immediate motion to dismiss all charges against me with prejudice. She stated that in light of the new, overwhelming evidence of entrapment and police corruption, the state could not in good conscience proceed. The judge signed the order, the gavel banged. Just like that, I was free. But as I walked out of the processing center an hour later, clutching a clear plastic bag containing my wallet, my keys, and the cheap watch I'd been wearing on Christmas Eve, I did not feel free. I felt hollowed out. I was still wearing the gray prison-issue sweatpants and a sweatshirt that was 2 sizes too big for me. They smelled of industrial detergent and other people's sweat. The cold winter air hit my face, sharp and biting, but it didn't wake me up. I felt like I was sleepwalking through a landscape I no longer recognized. There were no news cameras waiting outside the back exit. The media circus had moved to the front, hungry for shots of my father and brother being loaded into federal transport vans. But there were people waiting for me. My mother, Teresa, stood near the chain-link fence. She was wearing her old blue parka, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold her body together. Her eyes were swollen, red raw from hours of crying. Next to her stood Jonah. He was leaning against a nondescript sedan, looking less like the tactical force of nature he had been in the courtroom and more like a tired man who had just finished a very long shift. When Mom saw me, she made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She ran to me, stumbling a little on the icy pavement. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in the rough fabric of my prison sweatshirt. She begged me to forgive her. She said it over and over again. She said she was so sorry. She said she had been so afraid. I stood there, stiff as a board, my arms hanging at my sides. A month ago, I would have hugged her back instantly. I would have told her it was okay. But the part of me that used to smooth things over had died in that cell. Then, I looked down at her, really looked at her. I saw the way she flinched when a car backfired nearby. I saw the deep lines of anxiety etched around her mouth. I remembered the way she used to go quiet whenever Dad raised his voice. I realized then that I wasn't the only prisoner in the lockhouse. I had been in a cell for a month. She had been in one for 30 years. I slowly raised my arms and wrapped them around her. I did not tell her it was okay, because it wasn't, but I told her I was there. Jonah opened the car door for us. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod of acknowledgement. We didn't go home. I don't think any of us could stomach the idea of that house yet. Instead, Jonah drove us to a small 24-hour diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with sticky tabletops and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. We sat in a booth in the back. Mom sat next to me, refusing to let go of my hand, as if she thought I might vanish if she loosened her grip. Jonah sat across from us. He ordered 3 black coffees and a plate of fries. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key and a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid them across the formica table toward me. He told me that we needed to talk about Agnes, my grandmother, the woman who had taught me how to knit and how to make apple pie, the woman I thought was just a sweet, simple lady who loved crossword puzzles. Jonah told me that Agnes' heart was sharper than anyone gave her credit for. He said that 5 years ago, shortly before she got sick. She had come to him. She had seen things. She had seen the way Martin looked at the garage, not as a business, but as a kingdom. She had seen the way Cole looked at Martin not as a father, but as a bank. And she had seen me, the quiet one, the pleaser, the one who did all the work and got none of the credit. Jonah explained that Agnes was terrified that one day, Martin's greed would demand a price that the business couldn't pay. She feared that when the walls started closing in, they would look for someone to throw under the bus. So she made a plan. Jonah told me that the trust fund wasn't millions of dollars, but it was substantial. It was money she had inherited from her own family, money she had quietly moved into offshore accounts and diversified portfolios over decades, keeping it completely hidden from Martin's prying eyes. She had set up a blind trust through a shell nonprofit organization that Jonah had helped her create. But there was a catch, a condition. The funds were not to be released when she died. They were not to be released when I turned 25 or 30. The trust had a single, specific trigger clause. It could only be accessed if I was in legal or financial peril, caused directly by the actions of Martin or Cole Locke. I stared at the key. My grandmother had bet against her own son and grandson. She had anticipated their betrayal years before it happened. She had turned her inheritance into a parachute, rigged to open only when they pushed me out of the plane. Jonah said that the key was for a safe deposit box at the First National Bank in the next county. He said the money was mine, all of it, enough to start over, enough to leave Ravensbridge and never look back. I took the envelope. It had my name written on it in Grandma Agnes's shaky, elegant cursive. I felt a lump rise in my throat, hard and painful. I had felt so alone in that cell, thinking I had been abandoned by my entire bloodline, but I hadn't been abandoned. I had been protected by a ghost and a homeless detective. We eventually left the diner. We had to go back to the house to get clothes, to figure out what to do next. The drive was silent. When we turned onto our street, the scene that greeted us was like a physical blow. The house, the place where we had eaten Christmas dinner, the place where I had grown up, was wrapped in yellow crime scene tape. It looked like a package that no one wanted to open. There were bright orange stickers on the front door. The garage was completely sealed off, with a police cruiser parked in the driveway to ensure no one tampered with the scene. It looked dead. It looked like a carcass that had been picked clean. Mom started to cry again. She said we couldn't go in. She said she couldn't face the neighbors, who were peeking out from behind their curtains, watching us with that hungry, judgmental curiosity. She was right. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. It was a monument to a lie. I made a decision. I told Jonah to drive us to the hospital. Mom worked there. I knew they had temporary housing for staff in crisis or traveling specialists. It wasn't fancy, just small, furnished apartments near the parking structure. But it was neutral ground. It was safe. We spent the next 2 hours filling out paperwork. The hospital administration, having seen the news, expedited the request. By 8 o'clock that night, we were standing in a small, beige apartment on the 4th floor. It smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. There was a kitchenette, a small sofa, and 2 twin beds. It was the farthest thing from home imaginable, and yet, as I locked the door and slid the deadbolt into place, I felt the first true breath of air enter my lungs in weeks. Mom took a shower to wash off the day. I could hear the water running and the muffled sound of her sobbing. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the streetlights from the parking lot casting long orange shadows across the floor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. My hands were shaking as I broke the wax seal. The paper inside was thin, expensive stationery. The smell of lavender, her perfume, wafted up, faint but distinct, instantly transporting me back to her living room. I read the letter. She wrote about how much she loved me. She wrote about how proud she was of my kindness, my patience. She wrote about how she wished she could have protected me while she was alive. She confirmed everything Jonah had said. She knew Martin was corrupt. She knew Cole was weak. She knew that a storm was coming. But it was the final paragraph that made me stop. It was the final paragraph that seared itself into my brain. She wrote, "My dearest Evie, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Your heart is broken, and your anger is righteous. You have the means now to destroy them, or to leave them to their fate. But remember this: if one day you are forced to choose between vengeance and saving someone else from the same pain you felt, choose wisely. The greatest power in the world is not the ability to punish those who hurt you. It is the ability to decide who you will become after the betrayal. Do not let their darkness turn you into something you are not." I lowered the letter. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about Martin, sitting in a cell. I thought about Cole, looking at me with those terrified eyes. I felt a rage burning in my gut, a desire to use every cent of this money to ensure they rotted in prison for the rest of their lives. I wanted to hurt them. I wanted them to bleed the way I had bled. But then I thought about the other people Jonah had mentioned, the other victims, the drivers who had been framed, the people who didn't have a grandmother watching out for them. I looked at the key in my hand. It was heavy. It was a weapon, yes, but it was also a tool. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't the same Evelyn who had cooked that turkey. That Evelyn was gone, but I wasn't Martin Locke's daughter either. I was something else, something new. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, clutching the letter to my chest, I realized that tomorrow I had a choice to make. I could just survive, or I could start a war. But this time, it would be a war fought on my terms. The transition from defendant to star witness is a disorienting shift. Only a few weeks ago, I was the one sitting in the interrogation chair, sweating under the harsh lights while my brother listed my imaginary crimes. Now, the tables have turned completely. I am sitting in a conference room at the federal building, surrounded by serious men and women in dark suits, while Martin and Cole are the ones in the cages. The case has been restructured. It is no longer a local matter. The Department of Justice has taken over, and the list of charges against my father and brother reads like an encyclopedia of felonies: conspiracy to distribute narcotics, money laundering, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, attempted murder, relating to Jonah's accident 3 years ago, and more specifically regarding me, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The lead prosecutor is a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She is sharper than Marcia Holt, with a demeanor that suggests she does not sleep. During our third prep session, she leaned across the mahogany table and looked me dead in the eye. She told me that the physical evidence Jonah provided is excellent. We have the video, we have the financial records, we have the audio tapes, but she said that to truly bury them, to ensure the jury does not find a single ounce of sympathy for a decorated officer and a local businessman, she needs the psychological component. She wants me to testify not just about the drugs, but about the house. She wants me to paint a picture of the control, the manipulation, the lifetime of being told I was less than nothing. She wants to show that framing me was not a desperate, last-minute decision, but the logical conclusion of 30 years of emotional abuse. I hesitated. A dark, ugly part of me wanted to do it. I wanted to stand on that stand and scream. I wanted to tear down the facade of the good father and the hero brother until there was nothing left but the small, vicious men underneath. I wanted to humiliate them the way they had humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood on Christmas Eve. But another part of me felt a cold dread at the thought, if I let all that poison out, Would I ever be able to close the valve again? If I spent days on the stand reliving every cruel word and every dismissed achievement, would I be destroying them or just re-traumatizing myself? Jonah saw the conflict in my face. He waited until the lawyers had left the room for a coffee break before he spoke. He was sitting in the corner, as he always did, watching the door. He told me that he had enough evidence to put them away for the rest of their natural lives without me saying a word about my childhood. He said the choice to testify about the family dynamic was mine alone. He told me that if I spoke, I should do it because I wanted to reclaim my own story, not because I wanted to destroy theirs. He said there is a difference between justice and revenge, and that difference is how you sleep at night when it is all over. His words made me rethink everything. I began to understand that true justice is not about inflicting pain. It is about revealing the truth. During these sessions, the FBI agents showed me files. They laid out photographs on the table that made my stomach turn. I was not the first person Cole had framed. There was a truck driver named David, a man with 3 kids, who had been pulled over by Cole 2 years ago. Cole had found a bag of methamphetamine in his cab. David lost his job, his license, and eventually his family. He was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a state penitentiary. There was a young college student who had filed a complaint against one of Cole's friends. She was arrested for possession a week later. I stared at their faces. They looked tired. They looked defeated. I felt a crushing wave of survivor's guilt. Why did I get the miracle? Why did I get the grandmother who planned ahead and the rogue detective who watched over me? These people had nothing. They were crushed by the same machine that tried to crush me, but no one jumped out of the audience to save them. That was when I knew I had to testify, not for me, not to hurt Dad, but for David, for the student, for everyone who had been ground into dust by the Locke family business. We finally opened the safe deposit box at the bank on a rainy Tuesday. The process was quiet and solemn. When the bank manager left us alone in the viewing room, I used the key Jonah had given me. Inside was a stack of bonds and a cashier's checkbook linked to the trust. It was not a fortune. It was not the kind of money that buys private jets or islands. It was a little over $300,000. To some, that might not seem like much, but to me, standing there in my thrift store coat, it looked like freedom. It was enough to rent a safe apartment for Mom and me for a few years. It was enough to go back to school if I wanted. But more importantly, it was enough to hire a real lawyer, not a public defender like Darren, who meant well but was out of his depth. And it was enough to start a legal defense fund for David and the other victims. When I told Mom about the money, she cried. But they were not the frantic tears of the woman who stood outside the jail. They were quiet tears of relief. Teresa Locke had changed in these few weeks. The shock of the arrest and the reality of Martin's betrayal had broken something in her. But what grew back was different, harder. One evening, while we were eating takeout in our small hospital apartment, she put down her fork and looked at me. She said she was going to testify. I told her she did not have to. I told her the lawyers said they had enough. She shook her head. She said she had to. She confessed that for years. She had heard snippets of phone calls. She had seen envelopes of cash that Martin hid in the floor safe. She knew things were not right. She knew Cole was doing things a police officer should not do. But she had been afraid. She had been afraid of Martin's temper, afraid of losing her home, afraid of shattering the illusion of her perfect family. She said her silence was the soil in which their crimes grew. She said she could not change the past, but she could refuse to be silent anymore. For the last 3 nights before the trial, I practiced my testimony in front of the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light hummed, casting harsh shadows on my face. I rehearsed the sequence of events on Christmas Eve. I recounted the arrest, but every time I got to the part where I looked at my father and begged for help, my throat closed up. I could hear his voice in my head, clear as a bell. This house does not shelter criminals. It was a sentence that had severed my life in 2. Before that sentence, I was a daughter. After that sentence, I was a suspect. I had to learn to say those words out loud without crying. I had to learn to repeat them to a jury without my voice shaking. I had to strip the pain out of them and leave only the cold, hard fact of his betrayal. I stood there for hours, saying it over and over again until the words lost their emotional sting and became just data points in a timeline. The night before the trial began, I barely slept. When I did drift off, I had a vivid, lucid dream. I was in the courtroom. Martin and Cole were there, shackled to the table. In the dream, there were two versions of me standing at the witness box. The first Evelyn was screaming. She was throwing the evidence at them. She was laughing at their misery. She was filled with a hot, red energy that felt powerful, but also poisonous. She looked like Martin. She had his anger. She had his cruelty. The second Evelyn was quiet. She stood tall. She wore a simple gray suit. She looked at them not with hate, but with a profound, distant pity. She told the truth, simply and clearly, and then she turned her back on them and walked out of the courtroom, into the sunlight. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in the dark room. The clock on the nightstand read 4 a.m. I lay there, listening to the sound of my mother breathing in the twin bed next to mine. I knew which Evelyn I had to be. The angry Evelyn might feel good for a moment. It might feel like victory to spit in their faces, but that would mean I was still engaging with them. It would mean they still had the power to dictate my emotions. The quiet Evelyn, the one who told the truth and walked away, was the one who was truly free. I got out of bed and went to the window. The city of Ravensbridge lay spread out below me, still dark and sleeping. Somewhere out there, in a federal holding cell, my father and brother were waking up to the first day of the end of their lives. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was not afraid anymore. They had taken my house, my job, and my reputation. They had tried to take my freedom, but they had failed. I went to the closet and took out the suit I had bought with Grandma Agnes's money. It was navy blue, sharp, professional. It was not the clothes of a victim. It was the armor of a woman who was done being afraid. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at the small table and watched the sun come up, turning the sky from black to bruised purple to a brilliant, piercing gold. Today, I would walk into that courtroom. I would look them in the eye, and I would bury the Locke family legacy, not with a shovel, but with the truth. The courtroom was no longer just a room. It had transformed into a coliseum. The wooden benches, usually sparsely populated by bored retirees and anxious relatives, were packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick and hot, smelling of wool coats, damp umbrellas, and the electric hum of anticipation. Outside, satellite trucks from every major news network lined the street. I had seen the headlines on my phone before I turned it off. They were sensational, printed in bold, black letters. Garage owner and cop's son accused of running drug ring, daughter almost sacrificed as shield. I walked down the center aisle. My heels clicked on the linoleum, a rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I kept my eyes fixed forward, but I could feel the gaze of the room on my skin. To them, I was a character in a dark, twisted fairy tale, the sister who survived the wolves. I took my seat at the prosecution table next to Sarah Jenkins. Only then did I allow myself to look at the defense table. Martin Locke sat on the far left. He looked thinner than I had ever seen him. His suit, usually tailored to perfection, hung loosely on his frame. His skin had a gray, papery quality to it, but his eyes were unchanged. They were hard, flinty, and filled with a terrifying arrogance. He did not look like a man facing life in prison. He looked like a king who was temporarily inconvenienced by a peasant uprising. He looked at me once, then looked away with a dismissive sneer that I felt in my gut. Cole was different. He sat next to his lawyer. His posture slumped. He had lost weight, too. But on him, it looked like he was being eaten from the inside out. His hair was unkempt. When our eyes met, I expected to see the cold, professional mask of Officer Locke. Instead, I saw a raw, naked panic. There was shame there. Yes, but also a desperate, silent pleading. He looked like he wanted me to fix this. He looked like he wanted his big sister to tell the scary men to go away. It was a look that might have broken my heart a month ago. Today, it just made me feel cold. Jonah Mercer was the first called to the stand. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life testifying. He recounted the investigation. He detailed the fake accident. He explained how he had lived as a ghost for 3 years, eating out of dumpsters and sleeping on park benches, all to gather the string that would hang these men. Then he played a new tape. It was a recording from 2 years ago. I had never heard this one. It was Martin and Cole talking in the garage office. They were discussing a rival mechanic who had started asking too many questions about the constant truck traffic at night. "He is becoming a problem," Cole's voice said on the tape. "He is asking about the manifests." "Problems have solutions," Martin's voice replied, calm and deadly. "Accidents happen. Maybe a truck backs up too fast. Maybe he doesn't see it coming. If he gets flattened, well, it is a dangerous industry." A collective gasp went through the room. I felt sick. My father wasn't just a thief or a smuggler. He was a man who discussed murder as casually as he discussed changing an alternator. When Jonah stepped down, the room was buzzing with a dark energy. The prosecution called my name. "The prosecution calls Evelyn Locke." I stood up. My hands were ice cold. I rubbed them against the fabric of my navy skirt, took a deep breath, and walked to the stand. The wooden gate swung open. I climbed the 3 steps. I sat down. The chair was still warm from Jonah. I swore to tell the truth. Sarah Jenkins started gently. She asked me about my job. She asked me about my relationship with my family. I told the jury about growing up in the Locke house. I kept my voice steady, though my chest felt tight. I told them about how Martin used to line us up for inspection. I told them how he always praised Cole's strength and mocked my sensitivity. "He used to tell me I was too soft for this world," I said, looking directly at the jury. "He said my heart was a defect. He said I would get eaten alive if I didn't toughen up. For 20 years. I thought he was trying to teach me how to survive. I didn't realize he was grooming me to be a victim." Then she asked me about Christmas Eve. I closed my eyes for a second. I could smell the cinnamon. I could hear the crackle of the fireplace. "It was supposed to be perfect," I said. I had spent 2 days cooking. The house smelled like roasted turkey and pine needles. Bing Crosby was playing on the stereo. My mother was happy. For a few hours, it felt like we were a real family. I described the lights flashing in the window. I described Cole walking in. I described the way he looked at me, not as a brother, but as a target. "He didn't hesitate," I said. "He pulled out the handcuffs. He spun me around. He read me my rights in the same living room where we used to open presents. And when I looked at my father, begging him to help me, he just crossed his arms." I looked at Martin. He was staring at the wall, refusing to meet my gaze. He told me, "This house does not shelter criminals." That was the last thing he said to me before they dragged me out into the snow. I paused. In the silence, I heard a sniffle. I looked out at the gallery. In the 3rd row, a young police officer, a rookie by the looks of him, was wiping tears from his eyes. He was looking at Cole with a mixture of betrayal and disgust. Sarah Jenkins let the silence hang for a moment before asking her final question. "Ms. Locke, if Jonah Mercer had not been in that courtroom 2 weeks ago, if he had not revealed the truth, where do you think you would be right now?" I looked at Cole. I locked eyes with him. I wanted him to hear this. "I would be in a cell," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "I would be staring at a concrete wall, serving a 25-year sentence, and the worst part is not the prison. The worst part is that I would be sitting there believing that I deserved it. I would be believing that I was stupid, that I had missed something, that I was born to be punished, and my brother." I pointed at Cole. "My brother would still be out here. He would be the hero. He would be the grieving officer who did his duty. He would be getting promoted, and every Christmas, he would probably drink a toast to the sister he sacrificed to keep his secret." Cole flinched. He actually physically recoiled, as if I had struck him. "No further questions," Sarah said. Martin's lawyer stood up. He was a high-priced attorney from Chicago, a man known for tearing witnesses apart. He adjusted his tie and walked toward me with a predatory smile. "Ms. Locke," he began, his tone patronizing, "you have described a very dramatic childhood, but isn't it true that you have always been emotional? Your father described you as sensitive. Isn't it possible that you are interpreting his strict parenting as malice? Isn't it possible that you are reimagining these events through the lens of a victim complex?" He was trying to gaslight me. He was trying to use the very softness my father hated against me. Before I could answer, Sarah Jenkins stood up. "Objection," she said. "If counsel wants to discuss the defendant's view of his daughter's personality, I have a piece of evidence that speaks to that directly. Prosecution would like to play Exhibit 4C. The judge nodded. The audio played. It was the recording from the garage, the one Jonah had mentioned but not played in its entirety. Martin's voice filled the room. He was laughing. It was a wet, ugly sound. "You know, I always worried Evie was useless," Martin said on the tape. "She has no spine. She cries at commercials. But it turns out, that makes her the perfect patsy. Who suspects the crying girl? She is actually more useful to me in handcuffs than she ever was as a daughter." The lawyer froze. The color drained from his face. He looked back at Martin, who was now glaring at the speaker as if he could will it into silence. The jury looked horrified. The idea that a father could laugh about his daughter's utility as a prisoner was so grotesque that it sucked the air out of the room. The lawyer stammered, No further questions." I stepped down. My legs felt shaky, but my head was high. Then came the final blow. "The prosecution calls Teresa Locke." My mother walked to the stand. She looked small. She looked fragile, but she walked with a determination I had never seen before. She sat down and placed her hands on her lap to stop them from trembling. She testified about the phone calls. She testified about the cash. And then, Sarah asked her why she had never spoken up before. Mom looked at Martin. For the first time in 30 years, she looked him in the eye without flinching. "Because I was afraid," she said, her voice shaking but audible. "He told me that if I ever asked questions about the business, he would smash my face in. He told me that I was nothing without him. He told me that if I left, he would make sure I never saw my children again." The courtroom went deadly silent. The image of Martin Locke, the pillar of the community, the successful businessman, was dissolving. Underneath the suit and the money, there was just a bully who beat his wife and sold his children. "I let him hurt Evelyn," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "I let him sacrifice her because I was too scared to save myself. But I am not scared anymore. He is not a king. He is just a criminal." When she finished, Martin looked small. He looked like a man whose foundation had just crumbled into dust. The judge asked if I had anything to add before I left the witness area. As part of a victim impact statement clarification, it was procedural, a chance to clarify damages. I stood up one last time. I looked at the judge. Then I turned and looked at the gallery, at the cameras, at the people of Ravensbridge who had watched my arrest with such glee. "I do not want their money," I said, "and I do not want their apologies." I turned to look at Martin and Cole. For my whole life, I tried to be what they wanted. I tried to be good. I tried to be quiet. But they mistook kindness for weakness. They thought that because I did not fight, I could not fight. I took a breath. I am not standing here to destroy my father and my brother. They did that to themselves. I am standing here to return the names to the people they hurt, to David, the truck driver, to the families they poisoned, and to myself. I looked at Cole. "You are not a hero, Cole, and I am not a victim. I am the witness, and that is powerful enough." I sat down. For 3 seconds, the room was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, the sound of pens scratching furiously on paper filled the air like the sound of falling rain. The flashbulbs erupted. The spell was broken, but the truth was out. The statue of the Locke family had been pulled down, and all that was left was the rubble. The day of the sentencing. The courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like a compression chamber. Every seat was taken. People were standing in the back, pressed against the mahogany doors. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and nervous sweat. I sat between Jonah and my mother, my hands tucked deep into the pockets of my navy blazer. My fingers were wrapped around the envelope containing Grandma Agnes's letter. The paper was soft and worn now, the edges fraying from how many times I had held it, but it was the only anchor keeping me from floating away in the storm of noise around me. Across the aisle, the defense table looked different. The expensive suits were gone. The polished watches were gone. Martin and Cole sat there in bright, dehumanizing orange jumpsuits. The color was violent against the muted wood tones of the room. It stripped away their authority. It stripped away the illusion of the successful businessman and the hero cop. They were just two men in state-issued polyester, waiting to be told when they would die. Judge Harrison did not waste time with preambles. He shuffled his papers, the sound amplified by the microphone, echoing like dry leaves in a dead forest. He looked over his spectacles at my father. He spoke with a voice that tolerated no interruption. He said that Martin Locke had treated his community like a parasite treats a host. He listed the charges one by one: trafficking in narcotics, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. He sentenced Martin Locke to 35 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Martin did not flinch. He did not cry. He sat there like a statue carved from spite. 35 years. He was 52. This was a death sentence in all but name. He would breathe his last breath behind concrete walls, surrounded by strangers who did not care about his garage or his legacy. Then, the judge turned to Cole. He looked at my brother with a specific kind of disappointment, the kind reserved for those who have been given power and used it to destroy the weak. He said that a badge is a heavy thing to carry, and Cole had dropped it in the mud. He cited the betrayal of public trust. He cited the entrapment of innocent citizens, and he made a point to mention the calculated framing of a family member. He sentenced Cole Locke to 22 years. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. It was a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to empty my lungs completely. 22 years. My brother would be 53 when he walked free. The best years of his life, the years he was supposed to spend building a career and a family, were gone, burned on the altar of our father's greed. The gavel banged. It was over. The bailiffs moved in. The sound of chains rattling filled the room. As they hauled Martin to his feet, he stopped. For the first time all day, he turned his head. He looked directly at me. I expected to see fear. I expected, perhaps foolishly, to see a flicker of apology. But Martin Locke did not do apologies. His eyes were narrow slits of pure venom. He looked at me with a hatred so intense it felt radioactive. He was blaming me. In his twisted mind, I was not the victim. I was the traitor. I was the ungrateful daughter who had dared to survive. A month ago, that look would have withered me. It would have made me question my reality. But today, I just looked back at him. I saw a small, angry man who had lost his kingdom. I realized then that I did not have to carry his anger anymore. It was his luggage, not mine. I did not blink. I did not look away. I watched him until the bailiff shoved him forward, breaking the connection forever. Then they came for Cole. He looked younger than his 31 years in that moment. He looked like a boy who had broken a window and was waiting for the punishment. As he passed the prosecution table, he slowed down. The bailiff tugged on his arm, but Cole resisted for a split second. He looked at me. His lip was trembling. Tears were streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the stubble on his cheeks. He did not speak out loud, but I saw his lips move. "I am sorry." The words were clear. They hung in the air between us, fragile and useless. I did not nod. I did not smile. I did not offer him the absolution he was begging for. I just looked at him with a profound, exhausted sadness. I was not angry anymore. I was just tired. I grieved for the brother he could have been. But I accepted the stranger he had become. His apology might help him sleep in his cell, but it did not undo the handcuffs. It did not erase the betrayal. The heavy oak doors at the side of the courtroom swallowed them both. They were gone. The courtroom erupted into noise as the session was dismissed, but I stayed seated for a moment, feeling the silence inside my own head. Jonah put a hand on my shoulder. He did not say anything. He just squeezed, a solid, grounding pressure. We walked out of the courthouse into a sea of microphones. The press had been waiting for the soundbite, the dramatic weeping of the victim. They wanted a show. I stopped on the steps. The wind was whipping my hair across my face. I looked into the cameras. I said that justice had been served, but there was no joy in it. I said that if my story gave just one person, one truck driver, one student, one daughter, the courage to speak up when they were being framed or abused, then the nightmare I lived through was not entirely meaningless. I turned and walked away before they could ask me how I felt about sending my father to prison. The days that followed were a blur of logistics. We moved out of the hospital housing and into a small, quiet apartment on the east side of town. It had big windows and no memories. A week later, I met with a lawyer, not for defense, but for incorporation. I used $50,000 of the money Grandma Agnes had left me to establish the Agnes Hart Legal Defense Initiative. It was not a big operation. There was no glass office building. It was just a fund, managed by a board of two, me and a retired civil rights attorney Jonah knew. The mission was simple: to provide competent legal counsel for low-income individuals in Oregon who were facing drug charges that showed signs of police misconduct or procedural entrapment. It was a humble way to fight back. I was not building an empire. I was just trying to make sure that the next time a Cole Locke tried to ruin a life, there would be someone there to stop him. 3 weeks after the trial, Jonah called me. He was leaving Ravensbridge. We met one last time at the industrial park, at the bench where I used to bring him coffee. The snow had melted, leaving the grass brown and matted. He was wearing a clean jacket now, and he had shaved. He looked like a detective again, sharp and ready for the next case, but his eyes were still the eyes of old Ben, watchful and weary. He told me that Agnes had been right about me. He said that my father had mistaken gentleness for cowardice. He said that the girl who brought sandwiches to a homeless man was the only one tough enough to break the cycle of corruption that had rotted the family for a generation. I sat on the cold wood of the bench, looking at the rusting fence. I asked him if he ever regretted waiting. I asked him if he regretted letting me go through that arrest, that night in the cell, the terror of the trial. Jonah looked at the ground. He was silent for a long time. When he looked up, his expression was pained. He said he regretted it every single night. He said he hated himself for using me as bait. But then he told me the hard truth. He said that if he had moved sooner, if he had tried to arrest them before they committed the act on Christmas Eve, Martin would have wiggled out, the charges would not have stuck, and eventually, Martin would have realized I was a liability, and he would have done something far worse than arrest me. He said we would both be dead if he had played it any other way. It was a brutal answer, but it was the truth. Justice is not a clean thing. It is messy, and it demands a price. I had paid mine. He stood up and shook my hand. Then he walked away, disappearing down the street just like he used to when the sun went down. Only this time, he wasn't hiding. He was moving on. 1 year later. It is December 24th. I am standing outside the Ravensbridge courthouse. The sky is a heavy, bruised purple, promising a storm. Snow is beginning to fall. Big, fat flakes that stick to my eyelashes. It looks exactly like it did the night Cole arrested me. The air smells the same, crisp, cold, and smelling of impending winter. But everything else is different. I am not wearing handcuffs. I am wearing a thick wool coat that I bought with my own money. I am not shivering from fear. I am standing with my feet planted firmly on the ground. I am holding 2 cups of coffee from the bakery on 4th Street. They are hot, the steam rising in the frigid air. I walk up the steps to the side entrance, near the pillar where the homeless sometimes shelter from the wind. There is no one there today. I place one of the cups on the concrete ledge. It is a ritual, a tribute to the girl I used to be, and to the man who wore a mask to save me. My mother is waiting for me by the car. She looks healthy. She has started taking art classes. She smiles when she sees me, a genuine smile that reaches her eyes. I look back at the courthouse one last time. It used to look like a fortress of doom to me. Now, it is just a building. It is just stone and mortar. I think about Martin and Cole, sitting in their cells, eating their Christmas Eve dinner on metal trays. I feel a flicker of pity, but it passes quickly, like a shadow under a cloud. I realize that Grandma Agnes was right. The greatest power isn't punishment. It is the refusal to let them turn you into a monster. They wanted me to be weak. They wanted me to be broken. Instead, I became the author of the ending. I turn my back on the courthouse. I walk down the steps, the snow crunching under my boots. I cannot choose the family that brought me into this world. I cannot scrub the DNA from my blood, but I can choose who I become now that they are gone. I am Evelyn Locke. I am not the sacrificial lamb. I am the one who picked up the hammer and shattered the glass house. And for the first time in 29 years, the silence in my mind is not empty, it is peaceful. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.